Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I expect that by the end of my talk I will have annoyed most of the people in the room, and that's okay. That's my job. I'd like to start by spending a little bit of time on terminology, because this is a very muddy area, and we tend to use an awful lot of terms for approximately the same thing. And that in itself may anger some people in the room, because people like to hold on to their definitions and like to think of their definitions as universal. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The terminology that we use in this area is quite slippery, and we cannot assume that what the language that we're using is understood in the same way by others. So we've got information literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, ICT literacy, computer literacy, computational literacy, technological literacy, meta literacy, and in fact we can substitute literacy with fluency or any other word. So it's a mess. But what I would like to suggest is that we not get too fussed over the labels that we use. But we do have to understand that contemporary understandings of literacy have expanded from our traditional understanding of that as reading and writing, and you might want to throw in numeracy and oralcy there as well. But these days we also talk about interpretive and creative abilities or competencies across a range of texts, both written and multimedias. So we also need to understand and acknowledge that those competencies are culturally situated. They're culturally situated, and so therefore, to be literate is to be able to make meaning within a particular social condition. And that meaning making differs whether you're here in contemporary cosmopolitan Sydney or someplace else across the world that is not quite the way it is here. But from a pragmatic point of view, I tend to think of digital literacy as the set of skills, knowledge, and attitudes required to access information, digital information, effectively, efficiently, and ethically. And I will insist on that ethical aspect of it. It includes knowing how to interpret and evaluate information, how to use it in meaning making, and for decision making in a range of contexts. And that can be creative activities, academic pursuits, daily life, in the workplace, of course. I also want to talk a little bit about the immense burdens that we've placed on this concept of digital literacy. From the UNESCO perspective, and UNESCO prefers media and information literacy as the preferred label, UNESCO believes that that is central to freedom of expression, empowering citizens to understand the functions of media and information providers, to enable critical evaluation of content, and to facilitate citizens making informed decisions as users and producers of information and media content. UNESCO likes to talk about information and digital literacy as contributing to sustainable human development, participatory civic societies, sustainable world peace, that's a big one, I think, freedom, democracy, good governance, and fostering of intercultural knowledge and understanding. Unfortunately, I think that those goals are pretty lofty, and they place considerable intellectual, political, and practical burdens on a concept like digital literacy. Sorry. And while some of those claims may have merit, there's no doubt, at least in my mind, that there's a significant element of hyperbole in them. And I also believe, speaking as a trained librarian, that when those kinds of claims come from the lips of professional librarians, that there is a bit of a motivation for self-preservation in those claims. So it is our community of practice as librarians that has most emphatically claimed ownership of digital literacy. And deconstructing those motivations has been the work of others, but the fact remains that we see ourselves at the forefront of those goals, and we like to own that. I also think that we need to put digital literacy in the context of what we understand about information practices. And those practices are culturally and socially situated, they're mediated, they're co-constructed in social ways with other people in their particular social and cultural milieu. So those information practices are situated, social, and embodied. They're culturally and contextually bound, and therefore digital literacy takes very different forms depending on context. We also need to remember, as we think about digital literacy, that information seeking itself is a very dynamic process. It changes frequently, quickly, and information need itself changes. So we cannot assume those simple linear models of information seeking that we once relied on. We also have to remember many of the foibles of human behavior and cognition. So we need to remember that people are creatures of habit and that efficiency and convenience are typically the principles upon which most information behavior occurs. And we know also that things like source memory is fragile and easily confused. And that means that people don't remember how it is that they came to know something. They don't remember where information came from. That makes it very difficult to challenge existing beliefs or understandings because people find it very difficult to retroactively evaluate the information upon which those are based. In other words, teaching people to evaluate information is not straightforward. In fact, education of any kind does not work on a banking model, and as Brenda Durbin has taught us, we can't simply open people's heads and toss bricks of information into them and expect them to have any impact. We also know that a significant driver of decision-making is social conformity. So that if one's neighbors are doing something, then one is more inclined to do the same. And that is important when considering the techniques that one might use to encourage behavior change. So digital literacy is a necessary but insufficient basis for change. More important is appealing to social norms. Think of the massive campaign to end smoking. It was successful not because people were convinced of the physical harm caused by smoking, but because smoking was constructed as a negative social behavior, and that's what made it effective. So my claim is that if we account for social conditions and context, as well as for the complexity of information behavior, or information practices in general, and common cognitive confusions like confirmation bias, the potential for digital literacy to ameliorate social and political challenges is significantly minimized. I believe, too, that we also need to keep in mind that while some level of digital literacy might promote pro-social attitudes and behaviors, people balance meeting those needs with a more, balance meeting their own needs with a more altruistic focus on social benefits. So we really need to ask whether something like digital literacy alone can shift the balance of attention towards social good. Would a stronger grounding in digital literacy change the attitudes and behaviors of terrorist extremists? Could enhanced digital literacy alter violent worldviews or promote sustainable environmental practices? Unfortunately, we all know perfectly well-educated, digitally literate individuals who hold beliefs that other perfectly well-educated and digitally literate people would find abhorrent. So we also need to be clear about how digital literacy skills are developed. It's abundantly clear that these are not developed through experience alone, and that holds especially true for evaluation skills. Effective and efficient information finding skills take time and effort to learn. Information is organized in complex ways and can be difficult to evaluate. We recognize that for most people, their confidence in their digital literacy, in fact, far exceeds their actual abilities. Many people actually don't understand the context of information production, how or why it's produced, or the purposes for which different types of information are made available. And that also makes critical evaluation difficult. In addition, many people have difficulty respecting ethical boundaries when it comes to using information. So, what can we do? Well, digital literacy can presumably be learned from teachers in schools, but there is ample evidence for the challenges associated with that goal and the paucity of solid outcomes. And I'd be happy to go into that in more detail in the Q&A time if somebody wants to. At the post-secondary level, digital literacy instruction is often limited, often unsystematic or poorly implemented. And similar concerns apply to opportunities at public libraries and other community centers. A lingering challenge remains widespread but unfounded beliefs about digital natives. The relative skills and understandings of those folks and the assumptions that we make about the value of experience with ICTs without formal learning of skills. Another challenge is the assumptions that we make about the capacity of libraries to play significant roles in developing citizens' digital literacy skills. Libraries often face severe resource challenges. That won't be a surprise to anybody in the room. Library administrators may place relatively little emphasis on digital literacy instruction, and in fact, patrons may lack confidence in the potential for librarians for that kind of work. And my experience demonstrates that librarians are often very poorly trained for instructional work. And I accept that as an academic who teaches librarians to do that kind of work. Often, there's very limited coordination between school teachers and librarians in public libraries and academic libraries, as well as insufficient number of teacher librarians in schools in many jurisdictions globally. In fact, librarian positions have been eliminated entirely in schools. Where potential exists for cooperation across contexts, actual cooperation or coordination is rare. Let's think about the global challenges that the United Nations has articulated. And I'm going to list them, and I want you to think about the relative potential role for digital literacy to ameliorate any of these. And these are straight from the United Nations website, and I'm going to list them in alphabetical order. Africa, including democracy, peace, social and economic development, and human rights. Aging, AIDS, atomic energy, big data for sustainable environment and development goals. Children, climate change, decolonization, democracy, ending poverty, food, gender equality, health, human rights, international law and justice, migration, oceans and the law of the sea, peace and security, populations, refugees, water, and youth. So, I do want to say that I am convinced that digital literacy is critical to health outcomes, and that's particularly important when so much of our health information is available only online these days. It's also critical to workforce development, to participative governance, since participatory citizenship is dependent upon relatively sophisticated information finding skills. Increasingly, of course, governments are delivering information online and online only, and that requires citizens to be at least minimally digitally literate in order to access that information. And in addition, participation in the commons and in civil society depends on citizens' ability to find and evaluate information. That skill set is obviously still essential for the workplace, for competency across a range of jobs, since information gathering, manipulation, and application are key work tasks in most jobs. Those without good digital literacy skills will be marginalized in both private and public life, including employment. So I propose that what we need is two things. First of all, a very solid understanding of information behavior and information practices, and the place of digital literacy practices within that. And secondly, a great deal more collaboration between the players involved, between librarians and teachers at all levels, and of course, parents. Above all, I think what we need is a sense of perspective. Digital literacy is not a silver bullet, but it is an important goal, and it should remain on our practice and our advocacy agendas. Thank you.